Evening. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's Hove, and welcome to our 118th step in our walking tour through the Bible. And this evening, we're going to do the second book of the Chronicles. Now, I have to tell you that honesty is often the best policy, so I'm going to be honest. The second book of the Chronicles is probably the least interesting book of the Bible. It's frequently just ignored, it's never read at all. It starts off with a very long description of Solomon building the temple and a very detailed description of Solomon building the temple as well. And it gives us, if you like, a tour through the temple as it was in Solomon's time. Solomon did this, Solomon did that, all the bronze and all the stuff he installed in the temple. And indeed, it goes even further than that. It tells us who helped him, who supplied him, who the craftsmen were, and so on. A hugely detailed description of a building. And it's from this description, I suppose, that people who create recreations of Solomon's temple um, get their inspiration. So you look at what is said in the second book of the Chronicles, and you can more or less, in your mind, reconstruct the temple, and you can produce a model of the temple. And you've seen photographs, I'm sure, on the internet of what Solomon's temple looked like. Of course, you have a bit of a difficulty with the measurements and so on because they're not quite what we're used to. However, one of the things about all this description of the temple is that the temple no longer exists. It no longer exists in our time. As you know from seeing the news, Temple Mount exists. That is to say, Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, as it's called in Arabic, or as we call it in Italian, la spianata delle moschee, the esplanade of the mosques. Now, the Temple Mount is the Mount of Zion. It's a hill, except, of course, it's one of those hills that's undergone some modification over the years. In other words, it's been leveled off on top, more or less, and the sides have been sort of built up. And so it's more like a sort of an oblong, a cube, rather than a natural looking hill. One of the walls holding up the side, built by Herod the Great, is the Western Wall, the Koisel, as we call it in Hebrew. We used to call it the Wailing Wall, but we've stopped calling it that. That's not part of the temple, but that is some of the original structure of Mount Zion holding up one side of the temple. On top of the mountain, what you've got is the Dome of the Rock, which is very picturesque, which is, of course, the oldest Muslim building in existence, which is of great interest because the mosques in Mecca are not as old as the Dome of the Rock. At the Dome of the Rock, you've got the top of Mount Zion poking through the floor, which is something, incidentally, you have in several churches in Europe, such as Sacra di San Michele outside Turin, and also the little church of Saint Michel on the dans l'Aigle, I think it's called, at Le Puy in France. So you have this sanctuary on top of the hill, and then nearby you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque, originally a Crusader church called St. Mary the New. But of the temple, nothing remains. And of course, many of our Jewish brethren are very in mourning for the temple. They wonder what the temple looked like, and they think about the temple that will be built there. How will the temple be rebuilt? Can it be rebuilt? Will it descend from heaven at, at the behest of God? Anyway, it's a big problem, the temple no longer existing. Now, in the second book of the Chronicles, this lovingly reconstructed description of the temple is of a building that does not exist, because this second book of the Chronicles was written during the Persian period. In other words, the temple had been destroyed and then the temple was rebuilt. And it's really trying to tell us the Temple of Solomon is the forerunner of the second temple, and the second temple is the recreation of the Temple of Solomon. In other words, the second temple is just as good as the original temple. There is continuity between the two temples, even though there was a nasty interruption, a nasty blip of about 80 years between the destruction of one and the reconstruction of the other, the building of the other. Now, to understand, therefore, the loving description of the temple, one needs to look at the end of the Book of Chronicles, Second Chronicles, where the wicked kings have brought down the wrath of God on Israel, and the Babylonians come, they sack Jerusalem, they take the king off into exile, and in fact, it says God summoned the king of the Chaldeans, and he put their young men to the sword within the very building of their temple. So the young Judeans were killed in their own temple, not sparing young man or girl, or old and infirm. He put them all at his mercy. All the things belong to the temple of God, whether large or small, the treasures of the temple of the Lord, treasures of the king and his officials, everything he took to Babylon. He burned down the temple of God, demolished the walls of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces to the ground, and destroyed everything of value in it. And those who had escaped the sword he deported to Babylon, where they were enslaved by him and his descendants, until the rise of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the Lord's prophecy through Jeremiah. Until the country has paid off its Sabbaths, it will lie fallow for all the days of its desolation, until the 70 years are complete. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, to fulfill the words of the Lord through Jeremiah, the Lord roused the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, to issue a proclamation to have it publicly displayed throughout his kingdom. Cyrus, king of Persia, says this: "The Lord, God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to build him a temple in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. However, there is among you of all his people, whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up." So you have this terrible catastrophe. The temple is destroyed thanks to the wrath of God, thanks to the king of Babylon, who is obviously a very wicked man, but nevertheless is in a funny way doing the will of God because he's punishing the Jews for their apostasy. And then you have another king, the king of Persia, who overthrows the kingdom of the Babylonians. And this king of Persia, even though he's a pagan, nevertheless he acknowledges the God of Israel, and he allows the Jews to return to their country with a specific task of rebuilding the temple. So what we have in the Second Book of Chronicles is a lament for the old temple, but that is relativized by a very strong belief in the new temple. The new temple is going to take the place of the old temple. All will be well. So we have a tale of woe, destruction, and redemption. This is very important. In other words, God is redeeming his people. I think also the Book of Chronicles largely recreates or regurgitates the material that's in the Second Book of the Kings. There are one or two things that aren't in the books of the Kings that are in the books of the Chronicles, such as the murder of Zechariah, the son of the priest Jehoiakim, who is no, not Jehoiakim. It's by the king Joash, who was portrayed generally as one of the goodies in the Second Book of the Kings. Here is seen as a murderer of the son of his own, of his sponsor, the priest Jehoiada. That is in, I'll show you where that is, if you just bear with me 1 second. That is, let me find it, just before, it's the Passover, it's just before Hezekiah, here it is. Oh dear, I seem to have lost my page, sorry about that. No, it's about, yes, Joash. This is chapter 24. He's the guy who's a good guy who repairs the temple, but then he declines. After the death of the priest Jehoiada, the man who'd made him king, he turns to pagan ways and syncretistic ways. The spirit, and it says, chapter 24, verse 20, the Spirit of God then invested Zechariah, son of Jehoiada the priest. He stood up before the people and said, "God says this, why transgress the Lord's commands to your certain ruin? For if you abandon the Lord, he will abandon you." Then they plotted against him, and at the king's order stoned him in the court of the temple of the Lord. Thus King Joash, forgetful of the devotion which Jehoiada, the father of Zechariah, had displayed on his behalf, murdered his son who cried out as he died, the Lord will see and avenge it. This isn't in the Second Book of the Kings, and it's a pretty horrible crime. He murders the prophet Zechariah, and this is the prophet Zechariah who is mentioned later on in the Gospel, who is murdered in the temple itself. But at the king's command, he's stoned to death, despite the fact that he is the son of the king's great benefactor, the man who actually made the king king. This shows us the absolute depravity of some of the kings of Israel, of Judah, many of whom meet violent deaths. And then, of course, he says, the Lord will see this and avenge it, says Zechariah. And sure enough, the king is later wounded by the Arameans in a war. And after they retired, for they left him seriously wounded, his own retainers plotted against him to avenge the blood of the son of Jehoiada, Zechariah, the priest, and murdered him in his bed. In other words, it comes back to haunt him. Now, you cannot honestly say, as a historian, that Joash was murdered in his bed because he had murdered Zechariah, to whom he should have been grateful for the sake of his father. But that is how the chronicler sees it. God is a very vengeful God. If you do something wrong, God will see it and God will punish it. And that essentially is the whole theme of the Second Book of the Chronicles, except there's this other theme that comes in right at the end. Despite your wickedness, after 70 years of punishment in Babylon, the Lord will have you back, the Lord will restore you. And it's this word, restoration, one that will come up again and again in the Bible from now on. In other words, the God of Israel is a redeemer. Well, I think it's the most dull book in the whole of the Bible, but I've spoken about it for 12 minutes. So maybe it's not that dull after all. And it does introduce us to the topic of redemption. All the best. Goodbye.